I helped him because no one else did. That's the part people don't like to hear. They assume there was a reason, some hidden promise, some clever instinct. There wasn't. He was standing alone at the edge of the crowd, clutching papers he didn't understand, while everyone else pretended not to see him. When I stepped closer, a few people glanced over and smiled the way you do when you're certain someone else is making a mistake. He looked at me like he'd already been dismissed too many times to expect anything different. I remember the weight of that look, the way it asked for nothing, and somehow asked for everything. What I didn't know then was that helping him wouldn't just change his outcome, it would expose something everyone else had decided not to notice. And once that happened, there would be no way to pretend it was luck. I was young enough then to still believe effort spoke for itself. That if you showed up, paid attention, did what was right, things would eventually sort themselves out. I hadn't learned yet how often systems reward visibility over substance. The place where this happened wasn't dramatic. A public office, fluorescent lights, hard chairs, people waiting with numbered slips in their hands, eyes fixed on a screen that kept changing without explanation. It was the kind of room where patience thins quickly and dignity erodes quietly. I was there for my own reasons: paperwork, signatures, a process that moved slower than it should have. I noticed him because he didn't fit the rhythm of the room. Everyone else knew how to wait, when to stand, when to argue softly. He didn't. He was old, not just in years, but in posture. Shoulders rounded from carrying things longer than they were meant to. His clothes were clean but tired. He held a folder like it might disappear if he loosened his grip. Every few minutes, he looked up at the screen, then back down at his papers, as if hoping they'd rearrange themselves into clarity. People brushed past him, some annoyed, some amused. One clerk spoke to him sharply when he asked a question, then louder when he didn't respond fast enough. The answer she gave wasn't helpful. It wasn't meant to be. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that I had my own things to handle, that stepping in would only slow me down. Those thoughts came easily. They always do when inaction is socially acceptable. But I kept noticing him, how he flinched when his number was called and it wasn't his, how he whispered rehearsed sentences under his breath, how carefully he folded and unfolded the same page over and over, like a nervous habit trying to hold him together. Eventually, I realized what unsettled me wasn't his confusion. It was how normal it felt to everyone else. No one was being openly cruel. No one was shouting him down. They were just letting the process erase him, one small dismissal at a time. And I understood suddenly that whatever he was there for, whatever he stood to lose or gain, he was already losing simply by being overlooked. I didn't yet know what was in his folder. I didn't know what winning would even mean for him. I only knew that if I walked out without doing anything, I'd be agreeing with the room. And that felt like a decision I wasn't ready to own. When his number was finally called, he stood too quickly and dropped half his papers. They scattered across the floor, and no one moved to help. The clerk sighed, already irritated, already behind. I watched him crouch down, hands shaking as he tried to gather everything before being told to hurry. I stepped in without thinking, picked up the pages, stacked them in the order I guessed they belonged. He thanked me softly, embarrassed, like help itself was something he shouldn't have needed. At the counter, the problem became clear fast. The form he'd submitted was wrong. Not incomplete. Misfiled. A technical error buried under language no one had bothered to explain to him. The clerk told him he'd missed a deadline, that he'd have to reapply, that it could take years. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer all along. Something in me tightened. I asked a question. Just one. About an exception clause printed in small text at the bottom of one page. The clerk hesitated, scrolled, called a supervisor. The supervisor frowned, then looked at the papers again, longer this time. They stepped away to talk. The old man stood beside me, silent. I could feel his restraint, the way he didn't want Hope waking up just to be disappointed again. When he spoke, it wasn't to ask for help. "It's all right," he said. "I'm used to it." That sentence landed heavier than anything else that day. The supervisor came back with a different tone. Careful now. She said there might be a way to process the claim under a legacy provision. Rarely used. Almost forgotten. But valid. The clerk looked annoyed. The people waiting behind us shifted, impatient. I felt their eyes on me, the young man slowing things down, making noise where silence was expected. They asked for additional documentation, proof most people wouldn't still have. He did, from the same worn folder. As each page was reviewed, the room changed. Not loudly, subtly. The irritation softened into focus. The dismissal into curiosity. The supervisor asked questions now, not to end the conversation, but to understand it. Finally, she said it. "This qualifies." The old man didn't react at first. He just blinked. Once, like he wasn't sure the words were meant for him. When it sank in, he didn't smile. He exhaled. A long, careful breath, like someone setting something heavy down after years of carrying it. I realized then what he had almost lost wasn't just paperwork, or money, or entitlement. It was the outcome of a lifetime of patience, nearly erased because no one had thought he was worth slowing down for. As we stepped away from the counter, people avoided looking at us. The same people who had smiled earlier. The system hadn't changed, but it had been forced to see him. And that was the moment everything turned, quietly, irrevocably, for reasons far bigger than either of us had understood when I bent down to pick up those papers. After that day, I assumed our paths would separate, that I'd return to my life, and he'd return to his with a story no one would quite believe. That's how moments like that are supposed to work. Brief intersections, clean exits. That's not what happened. The process didn't end at the counter. It never does. Verification followed. Reviews. Waiting periods layered on top of one another. Each step reopened the possibility of reversal. I got calls from him in the evenings, hesitant at first, asking if a letter sounded right, if a request made sense. I told him what I could. Sometimes all I did was listen while he read things out loud slowly, making sure he hadn't misunderstood again. What surprised me was how quickly resistance returned once attention faded. Different clerks, different offices, the same subtle skepticism. He was asked to prove things he had already proven, to resubmit documents already accepted. The system seemed embarrassed. It had let something through and was now trying to correct itself. People spoke to him differently when I wasn't there. He told me that quietly, without accusation. "They explain things faster," he said. "I don't always catch it." So I started going with him when I could, sitting beside him in waiting rooms, standing near counters, not speaking unless necessary, just being visible. That visibility changed things, not because I was important, but because I wasn't old. Clerks slowed down. Voices softened. Instructions were repeated. The same information he'd asked for weeks earlier was now given freely. Watching it made something inside me harden. This wasn't confusion. It was filtering. As the claim advanced, the numbers became real, bigger than I expected. Life-altering in a way people like him rarely get to experience at the end of their lives. That's when curiosity around us shifted into something else. suspicion. Questions started coming from places that had previously ignored him. Requests framed as concern. Warnings about unexpected outcomes. Someone even suggested he might want professional representation now that things looked promising. The implication was clear. Now that there was something to win, others wanted proximity. He noticed it too. The change in tone. The sudden interest. One afternoon, while we waited for an appointment that kept being delayed, he said something I didn't expect. "They didn't mind when I was losing," he said. "They mind now." That was the moment I understood what was really escalating. Not the claim, the discomfort. People were uneasy not because the system had worked, but because it had worked for someone they'd already written off. His success disrupted the quiet agreement that some people are meant to wait forever, and others are meant to move ahead without noticing them. The closer he got to the final decision, the more fragile the room felt, as if everyone was bracing for something they couldn't quite name. And I began to realize that helping him win wasn't going to end with approval papers. It was going to force a reckoning with fairness, with visibility, and with the unspoken rules people rely on when they assume no one will challenge them. The decision came on a morning neither of us expected. No warning, no build-up. Just a call telling him to come in. He asked if I could come with him. Not urgently, almost apologetically. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The room was smaller this time. Fewer chairs. A single official behind a desk, folder already open. I recognized the posture immediately, the careful neutrality of someone about to deliver something final. They went through the summary quickly. Dates, references, verifications completed. Their voice stayed even, professional, but something underneath had shifted. Respect, maybe, or resignation. Then they said it. Approved. Fully. Retroactive. The number followed, spoken once, then repeated, like it needed to exist in the air before it could be believed. The old man didn't react the way people imagine winning looks. He didn't smile, didn't thank anyone. He just closed his eyes for a second, longer than necessary, and pressed his thumb against the edge of the desk as if to steady himself. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not joy, exactly. Relief mixed with anger. Because I could see it now, clearly. This outcome had always been possible. Nothing new had been discovered. Nothing miraculous had occurred. All that had changed was that someone had stayed long enough to insist he be seen. The official slid papers across the desk and asked him to sign. When he hesitated, pen hovering, she waited. No sighs, no impatience. That alone felt like a concession. He signed carefully, each letter deliberate, as if writing his name this time carried weight it hadn't before. When we stood to leave, the official said something unexpected. "You were persistent," she said, to him. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I was patient." Outside, the hallway buzzed with the same noise as always. Numbers being called, people waiting, lives suspended. No one noticed us pass. No applause, no acknowledgement. But something irreversible had happened. He had won, not because the system had been generous, but because it had been cornered by its own rules. And everyone who had looked past him before now had to live with the quiet truth that his victory wasn't luck. It was overdue. After that, life didn't transform overnight. That's something people like to add later, when they retell stories to make them cleaner. What changed wasn't his personality or mine. It was the way the world had to respond to him. The money arrived in stages, carefully, documented. Enough to make choices he'd never allowed himself to imagine. He moved out of the room he'd been renting for years and into a small apartment with sunlight in the afternoon. He fixed his teeth, bought new shoes, then kept wearing the old ones until they finally fell apart out of habit. People from the office called him differently now. Slower, more polite. Some even congratulated him, as if they'd been rooting for him all along. He listened without correcting them. Winning hadn't made him bitter. It had made him quieter. As for me, I went back to my life, but it didn't fit the same way anymore. I noticed things I used to ignore. Who was being rushed? Who was being talked over? Who had learned to apologize for taking up space? Once you see how injustice hides behind routine, you can't unsee it. We still talk sometimes. Not often. He thanks me too much. I tell him I didn't do anything special. We both know that's only partly true. What stays with me isn't the outcome. It's the memory of how close he came to losing everything simply because no one thought he was worth the delay. How easily that would have happened if I'd chosen convenience over attention. They never saw him. Not really. And that's what allowed him to win it all. Quietly, late in life, carrying the dignity they never managed to take from him. Even when they tried.